Hey guys, my name is Yashasvi Sharma, and today my element that I'll be presenting is literature review. So before I even tell you how to write a literature review or what it even consists of, we need to talk about what it is. So the literature review is a thing that carries your research paper. It should carry your research paper so much that it gets scoliosis from doing so. It's a joke. And so basically what it does, it's basically creating the framework for your research and kind of communicating to the graders why your research is important and why it should be valued within your specific field of study. So, one of the main things that it does is first set context. And this is really important, especially if your AP research topic focuses on something that is a little bit more complex and something that maybe not everyone would understand on the first pass. So, it's basically you telling your readers this is what you know from the research so far, and this is how it informed your understanding or changed your perspective on the issue. So, what is it? It is the very foundation of your paper. So it won't always be the first thing that is shown in your paper because sometimes people put an abstract or an introduction, but it is the third item at least in your paper. So it is something that is crucial to making a positive impression with the AP research readers and making sure that you get that 5 on the AP test. And I like to think of the literature review as setting the stage. It basically sets the foundation upon which you will be talking about your research method and process. So kind of how like we have plays and musicals, the stage is able to set the foundation for the actors, actresses, song, and dialogue within these productions to actually communicate a message to the audience. Similarly, the stage is literature review, allowing you to provide context and tell the graders what you already know about your topic, and it allows your other parts of the paper, like the methods or the discussion, to really shine because it fits with your literature review so well. So now that we know what the literature review is, we need to talk about what it actually does and how to write one. So I like to use a house party analogy when we talk about describing the literature review. So imagine you went to a house party, and obviously houses have very different rooms, and different rooms have different people. So maybe one room people are talking about one thing, and in a different room people are talking about another thing. Now this is where we see the huge gap quite literally, between AP Seminar and AP Research. With AP Seminar, in the individual research written report, you basically analyze a bunch of different sources, categorize them into perspectives, and then wrote about one singular perspective. So, for example, my personal AP Seminar topic was on bioterrorism. And so some of the different articles my team and I analyzed focus more on either public health, biological, social, economic, or political aspects of this war crime. And this is kind of true for the house party analogy as well. So imagine you're at a house party and you're at, these different rooms, and different rooms are talking about different things. So if this were a seminar, you would essentially go to each different room and they'd all be talking about the same topic, but different aspects of the topic. So basically, maybe one room is focusing more on the public health aspects of biological warfare agents. Maybe they're talking about here's why this virus is more effective, and here's how this virus spreads, and this is why this is detrimental to human society. Another room might be talking about the political impacts and implications of bioterrorism, maybe how it could be seen as a political motive, if countries even use biological weapons anymore, and when they were historically used as well. And third perspective could be economic. There are economic pressures from agro-terrorism. There's, finance is needed to recover from bioterrorist attack. There's many financial things involved when we talk about recovering from such a horrific crime such as this. So let's say you heard all these perspectives and you chose to write about one of them. So for this instance, you maybe chose to write about the public health perspective. So this is where kind of we see the difference, because with AP Seminar, you're taking pre-existing knowledge and reiterating in your own words. So for my personal IRR, I reiterated the bioterrorist public health perspective and communicated more information and linked more sources together that were talking about the same thing when it came to this topic. So I researched articles from the CDC or the National Institute of Health. There's really many different ways you can go about seminar, but this is not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about AP research. So the difference with AP research is that you go to a house party and there's different rooms of different researchers and they're all talking about what they did. And then you go home that night and you think, here's one thing I didn't hear in the conversation, and that's your gap, and that's the purpose of your literature review. So basically, you going to the house party is the literature review, and you telling the graders, here was my house party experience in a sense. So your literature review should kind of read almost as a comparison of sources. So not literally, but your sources need to be in conversation with one another. It's more interesting if your sources have differing opinions or all have the same opinion, but essentially they need to be providing context to the issue and introducing more sides and more nuance to your topic, which is very important. Because we're doing a scientific research-based analysis, it's important for us to rid ourselves of as many biases as possible, and this is also information bias. We cannot only be communicating one aspect of the issue, which is why this is so incredibly important. So with your literature review, if they all have the same perspective, that's great. But if they have different perspectives, that's great too. And we'll get more into how to introduce these sources later on. But essentially with AP Research, your literature review is basically describing what new thing that you'll be contributing to the scene. Obviously, you cannot read every single article in the world focusing on your topic, but it is important to identify what themes are not maybe as talked about or what themes haven't been addressed within the current body of knowledge, and your paper should essentially contribute to that. The whole goal of AP Research is to make us more curious and more inquisitive. So it's important for us to be able to have engaged further discussion on topics where we contributed something new to this discussion, which is always exciting, of course. So when you're introducing your gap at the end of the literature review, you kind of want to remind yourself of this scene from Simba, I believe, or that's the yellow cub that this guy is holding. So basically at the end, you're going to be explicitly stating your gap and how it's going to be contributing to the field of knowledge. So after your literature review, you summarize all your sources, you have direct quotations and inferences and charts and analyses from these different studies, and now you're telling the graders, hey, here's the new thing that my research brings. Here's something new that I bring to the table. And so this is the most crucial part of your paper because it also sets a framework for what you'll be talking about early on. Just like how we have a thesis statement to guide our essays, the literature review guides our research paper in a sense for both the writer and also the graders as well. Because for the writer, it helps us to keep our writings focused and organized. So if I have a literature review, I know not to bring up the same things over again in my methods, but to instead focusing on the new things I'm contributing to the field. And for the graders, it also gives them a sense of kind of a more chronological order, because the first thing you need to do is select a topic and also research on that topic. You're basically introducing to them in chronological order what you did, which is ultimately the goal here. You want to have a really cohesively written, well-written, eloquently written report of what you did during the past school year. So one big mistake is to present a gap that is already inherently obvious after reading the literature review. Like I said before, your gap needs to be something new. It needs to be something that wasn't really talked about in your house party experience or when you were researching and reading sources on the matter. So obviously, don't say that something is a gap when it really isn't because you talked about it in your literature review. So you need to make sure your key sources are also really focusing on things that are more broad aspects of the topic. If all of your sources on the literature review focus on one aspect of the topic, that isn't really giving the graders a clear perspective and a clear idea on what exactly you're researching. If I have all my sources from one topic, that's also presenting the information in like a poor way because you're only providing one side of the issue, so it doesn't leave any room for context or nuance. However, if we have multiple different sides of the issue, that's great because then the researchers can also form an opinion for themselves, and you can also talk about how reading these different sources and different perspectives only further your understanding. So don't be like this guy from Pokemon and talk about how a butterfly is a bird. Make sure your gap is not already previously stated in the literature review, because then it's not a gap anymore. It's just a reiteration. This is not seminar, this is AP research. You need to make sure that you're contributing something new to the field of knowledge, which is the most exciting part of this class. So let's go into my specific example. And before I go into this, I want to provide some context on my research paper and presentation. So I focused on neurofeedback, which is an emerging technology, and I basically evaluated it on both an effectiveness and accessibility scale to determine how feasible it could be used for patients living with absence epilepsy, a different specific type of epilepsy. So one of my first articles was essentially describing what is neurofeedback or what the treatment was. Because my topic was dealing with something that the common layperson wouldn't necessarily understand on first glance, it was important for me to both build a repertoire with both my audience and also my graders by providing context on the issue. The last thing you want to do when you're trying to communicate scientific finding is to further confuse your audience and further confuse your evaluators. Make sure that you're being as clear and coherent as possible and determining what specific things you read and what specific opinions you formed as a result of reading these sources. So as you can see here in my slide, this is exactly what I talked about. I talked about these different brainwave frequencies, and I really delved into the specifics of the study. So when I was discussing the source in my literature review, or when I was introducing it, this is the first source I was introducing. So I talked about how we need to open the discussion on a potential new treatment for absence epilepsy. And in my introduction, I had pointed towards a problem, which is we see more and more people living with the condition, which is why we need to have better medication options for everyone, no matter holistic or non-holistic. And highlighted in teal here is kind of the specific evidence that I cited from this specific source. So it's important to also introduce a researcher as well, which is why I introduced their name and also their credentials, so where they studied. And this is kind of a good formulaic way to present the sources and make sure that all aspects of the rubric are also being hit simultaneously. So when I was talking about my second source, which is the physical impacts of neurofeedback when it comes to muscle retention and muscle memory retention, because certain types of epilepsy do deal with physical movements and physical convulsions. So interestingly enough, I talked about how before the publication of this paper, there's actually a gap in research, and how this paper that I'm currently referencing now actually filled a gap in its time, where we talked about how neurofeedback was used for elite athletes. So I basically described the study, which was 11 athletes fired 36 arrows before and after receiving neurofeedback treatment, and the group that received the neurofeedback treatment showed significantly more better aiming results and better muscle memory results, which is statistically significant when interpreted at an appropriate confidence level. So this is really, really important because it talks about how it's a new perspective on the source. So like I said earlier, your sources cannot all be talking about the same thing. So you can choose to split it up based on how your topic is, but if your topic is something a little bit more complex and more nuanced, I would highly recommend the strategy where you firstly and foremost introduce what it is from a source, because that's the most crucial way to setting context and making sure that we understand your paper and your wonderful research. So when I was introducing my scholarly gap, here in the green, I have the kind of problem or call to action. So I basically talked about how there's an ever increasing rate of epilepsy diagnosis. And this is really important too. You want to remind your graders of the reason why your research is important. Because so if you just state your gap, they probably won't remember why you're doing the research in the first place or what problem explicitly you're trying to solve. So because of this, it's important for you to remind them that given X situation, in this case the ever increasing rate of epilepsy diagnosis, it is so important to talk about greater research dissemination and include more treatments when it comes to the medical horizon. And I also ended this literature review by saying this is where the scholarly gap exists, and you can see it explicitly like that as well. And we'll see this in another example that actually got a 5 on the AP research exam. So make sure you're being clear and direct and specific with your scholarly gap. So one thing I really like to think about when talking about the literature review, and especially where you introduce your scholarly gap, is pretend you're like a contestant on Shark Tank, where, you know, the 4 or 5 business people, they kind of sit and evaluate pitches from various entrepreneurs and business folk. So they're all pitching their new businesses. And, you know, a good business is one that solves kind of a niche problem. It's something that maybe people don't really consider. Maybe it either solves a new problem, it could also create a new problem, but also it could maybe solve an existing issue with an existing solution in a different way, and oftentimes a more effective way. So there's usually something that your business needs to fulfill on that accord. And the same is true for your scholarly gap. It needs to be able to contribute something beneficial to your field and some new findings as well. These could be either positive or negatively implicated, but at the end of the day, you need to be contributing something new to the body discussion because that's what you learned at the house party, like I mentioned earlier. So this is not necessarily going to be written in the form of a pitching, like here's why you should support my business. You're not talking about here's why I should get a 5 on this exam, but you are telling them this is the gap I'm going to fill, and you're providing the context for that as well. So, like, when someone who's presenting on the show, if they're presenting the solution to a really niche problem, they first want to explain what the problem is so that it's clear to the judges how this would have greater market value and how this would actually positively influence and impact society. So you don't want your Shark Tank or your AP research graders to say that they're out, like this guy right here. So make sure that you're explicitly stating your scholarly gap and doing so in a way that persuades the grader to almost be on your side and kind of root for you in the research process. You want to make sure that you are explicitly stating what you're doing and why it's beneficial, which is kind of what we do in Shark Tank, where you talk about how your business will successfully impact the lives of many, many others. So next we'll be looking at a correct example from a research paper that actually got a 5. So for some context, their paper was focusing on insect fear across 2 different age groups. So here in this pink right here, the first thing that they do is actually focus on existing studies and existing statistics, which is so important because they're essentially introducing what current evidence that we know about the topic, and they're integrating it into why their study is unique, which we'll see later on. So they talk about the specific percentages and prevalence ranges, and then they also do a bit of commentary right here where they talk about the studies themselves. But the key part right here is highlighted in teal. They say, my study examined this theory, specifically concerning insect fear, by comparing fear levels between 3rd graders and 5th and 12th graders. So it's the full decade of developmental difference. That last part right there about the developmental difference is kind of the unique thing that the researchers do in their study. Is it their gap? Not necessarily, but it is kind of them saying why their study is unique and why it provides a new perspective to the field. Because our current understanding of insect fear and age is really dealing with age groups that are narrowed together and that are close together. So if we compare 2 widely different ages and wide different age ranges, then maybe we can potentially determine at what age does the fear of insects actually go away or tend to go away in individuals. So at the end of the literature review, they actually wrote this where they talked about how the gap in the research study, they only were able to generalize their findings to West Central Florida, which is fine. That's also great because you're also acknowledging that your findings may not be generalizable to everyone on planet Earth. And their literature review ended with how their study was uniquely significant, and it talked about further topics that needed further exploring, which is how we see insect fear across 2 different age demographics. So overall, this literature review did an amazing job of not only indicating their sources, but also introducing new sources, as they firstly talked about a problem or a gap and then picked the appropriate source that filled that gap. And eventually they were talking about their own gap and how they aim to fill it in their research paper, which obviously they'll read later on. And the kind of ending paragraph of the literature review also beautifully explained, kind of summarize everything. You also don't want to make sure you're introducing new evidence in the end of your literature review. Typically you want to focus in on 3 to 5 main sources. And also keep in mind that depending on your method of inquiry, your literature review could also change. Some individuals who may be doing a physical building project where they're actually building something may have a shorter literature review, but some individuals who are maybe doing a thematic or content analysis may need to provide a longer literature review. And also this is also the scope of your topic. If it's a topic that is commonly understood, then maybe you don't have to provide the source that explains what exactly your topic is. But if your topic is a little bit more nuanced, it is always in your best interest to provide this to the reader. Remember, clarity supersedes everything, so you need to be able to make sure that everyone knows what your topic is about so that you aren't deducting points further on in the presentation for lack of clarity, which is also super important. So I hope that this video was helpful. I know that when I was writing the literature review, I was kind of lost too, but hopefully this video provides a good guide on what exactly your literature review needs to be doing and how exactly you can accomplish those steps. So remember the house party analogy, and also remember that you need to be really hyper vigilant about the gap in your study and how it needs to essentially positively affect the field of the body of knowledge surrounding your topic. I hope this was helpful, and please don't hesitate to consult online resources or ask other peers for help. When I was personally writing the literature review, I found it extremely helpful to have other people read my review and talk about, and because they actually don't work with my topic, it was really helpful because they were able to clearly tell me if I explained things well enough or not, which is always super important. And also, don't shy away from visuals or data visualizations in your literature review, but keep in mind you will be expected to also provide other visualizations when you talk about your results and your findings as well. And also make sure that your literature review has a link back. So when you conclude your research paper, you maybe want to include some of the elements in your literature review to kind of tie everything together. Again, these researchers, the AP graders, don't spend too much time looking at each paper, so it's important that you write a really well organized and clearly structured report, so that's easier for them to grade as well. So make sure you're doing your best to score as many points on the rubric as possible, and that's about it. I hope you have a wonderful day, and good luck writing your AP research paper. This class is so worth it, and you'll learn so much, and I definitely learned a lot about the essay writing process from this as well. So don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. But yeah, I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you.